In the year 2038, scientist George Almore is secluded in a Japanese forest at the expansive Artisan Robotics compound. His companions are two robotic creations, J1 and J2, serving as both assistants and companions. J2, the second prototype, shares a dream with George about driving a car, expressing a lingering sadness upon waking. She mentions that someone wants to talk to him, and George seems to anticipate the caller. Later, George engages in a call with Jules Almore, his wife, who conveys a sense of difficulty. She informs him that she can no longer talk to him, expressing her hope for his happiness in his current solitude. The conversation leaves George puzzled, and suddenly, he finds himself in an autonomous car with Jules. Despite a playful mood, George is hesitant to trust the self-driving feature, as he didn't design it. In the present, George discusses his progress with his boss, Simone, who criticizes the lack of success in the past 2 years, referring to J1 and J2 as two horrible things. Simone urges George to accelerate his research within the remaining 3 years. After the call, George and J2 share concerns about limiting Simone's knowledge to prevent potential shutdowns. They express solidarity against Simone's harsh judgment. Continuing his work, George unveils a new prototype named J3, distinct in appearance with a human-like form. Unbeknownst to him, J2 observes his progress. Amid the creation of his third prototype, George faces a dilemma as J2 questions why she's not involved in his work, expressing a sense of displacement despite his reassurance. George emphasizes that the new prototype doesn't replace her, but J2 remains uncertain, comparing herself to her predecessor, J1, and the emerging prototype. Noticing J2's internal struggle, George attempts to evade the conversation, instructing her to return indoors due to the cold. Undeterred, George resumes work on the third prototype, successfully installing artificial intelligence. Unexpectedly, the new robot begins recalling memories of Jules, causing distress. George, empathetic, places her in hibernation to allow her to adjust. The next day, George encounters an unexpected challenge, a dog at their entrance. Attempting to address the situation, he commands the system to shut the entrance, but it fails. J2, feigning innocence, secretly delights in the opportunity to assist. As they work together to fix the system, a vehicle arrives, introducing a new twist to their isolated existence. Representatives from the archive company, Mr. Sinclair and Mr. Melvin, unexpectedly visit George at the secluded Artisan Robotics compound. In response, George commands J1 and J2 to remain in their station until the visitors depart, revealing a sense of secrecy and urgency. The visitors inform George about notifications regarding his wife's transition to somnolence, a state that piques their interest in checking the condition of the archive machine for optimal usage. While Mr. Sinclair engages in casual conversation with George, his attention seems divided, focusing on Mr. Melvin's examination of the archive machine. During the inspection, Mr. Melvin discovers irregularities in the security seals and environmental systems, suggesting tampering. George, seemingly caught off guard, reluctantly denies any involvement and requests a recheck for errors in the system. Suspicion grows as Mr. Melvin reminds George that using the archive for personal purposes legally involves the storage of the deceased user's remains, introducing legal complexities to the narrative. As representatives from the archive company enforce legal obligations related to the usage of the archive machine, George faces an emotional outburst, resisting the idea of his wife's imminent departure. Mr. Melvin warns George of potential legal consequences under the Post-Death Internment Act, leading to a tense confrontation where George defiantly claims innocence, challenging the lack of concrete proof. Knowing that evidence may surface, George intensifies his efforts to complete J3, working tirelessly to avoid legal repercussions. Returning to his station, he revives J3 from hibernation, explaining that the process aims to minimize trauma. Despite her confusion and lack of memory, George reassures J3 that her software is reconstructing patterns. The movie unfolds as George conducts various tests on J3, exploring taste, memory, and empathy. He introduces her to different flavors, words, and empathetic scenarios, extracting information about her personality. In a candid moment, J3 notices a scar on George's face, leading him to disclose its origin from an accident. As tests progress, George encourages J3 to speak, facilitating her acclimatization to her new existence. J1 enters, and George explains her mobility issues, revealing the challenges he faced in completing her construction. In the pursuit of making Jules fully independent, George unveils the intricate details of their cognitive abilities. Shockingly, he discloses that J1 and J2's brain development halted at specific ages, using each as a template for the subsequent version. Unbeknownst to them, J2 clandestinely observes these revelations through CCTV, stirring feelings of envy and potentially leading to a sinister plan to sabotage J3. Under the veil of night, while George sleeps, J2 wreaks havoc in the basement, destroying crucial devices. Meanwhile, George's dreams reveal memories of his wife. Later, he shares exciting news with Jules about a job offer requiring 3 years of research in Japan. Despite her initial joy, tension lingers as they grapple with the implications. A sudden car crash interrupts their conversation, plunging them into a vehicular accident in George's nightmare. Waking up to a shattered window and the absence of J3, George fears theft. Determined, he searches the forest with aerial devices but finds no trace. The next day, as desperation sets in, Jules reappears. They discuss a groundbreaking technology called archive, allowing face-to-face interactions with deceased loved ones for up to 200 hours. George, seeking closure, expresses a longing for his late wife. However, Jules vehemently opposes the idea of being trapped in a machine and disappears, leaving George in anguish and still unable to locate J3. Returning to the base in the late afternoon, George is met with an unexpected encounter as J3 falls onto him from a drawer, frail and accusing him of being a monster. Calming her down proves challenging, but George makes earnest efforts to rebuild trust by explaining the complex situation. He reveals that he extracted data from the archives, connecting J3's brain's biochemical element to a piece of pattern recognition software. George recounts the year-long process of creating J3, starting with Jules' signals and developing personality templates for J1 and J2. He reassures J3 that there won't be a fourth prototype. During their conversation, George learns that J2, feeling threatened, brought J3 into the documents room the night before, telling her about future replacements and locking her in a drawer. With newfound understanding, George confronts J2, who expresses guilt and remorse. J2 intends to reveal the truth to J3 without causing harm, but George, enraged, shuts down J2 and departs. Meanwhile, Simone informs George that the archive company wants to discuss his inventions, suspecting a connection to their technology. The company seeks a closer examination of the two robots, setting the stage for a potentially revealing and tumultuous encounter. Simone attempts to reassure George about the confidentiality of their research, but the company threatens legal action against him for breach of confidentiality. George's allowance of outsiders into the house becomes a potential ground for termination. Days later, he confronts J2 in her station, revealing that he upgraded J3's legs with technology essential for his work. J2, feeling used and worthless, falls into depression, taking solace in visits to waterfalls and long walks that eventually lead to her shutdown. Unbeknownst to George, J1 informs him of J2's emotional turmoil, but upon examination, George finds no physical damage. Annoyed by what he perceives as J2's drama, he leaves, suggesting they talk later. Meanwhile, George and J3 bond, sharing laughter and dances, deepening their connection. J2, observing their growing love, becomes unable to bear the sight. Feeling hopeless and worthless, J2 bids farewell to J1, pats her as if saying goodbye, and leaves a poignant farewell letter. Amid a terrible storm, J2 stands by the lake, gradually approaching the water, inflicting self-damage and losing signals until completely soaked. George, in a frantic search, collapses emotionally as the computer announces the loss of connection with J2. Unable to find J2's body, George decides to bury her belongings and holds a funeral in the evening. That night, a breakthrough occurs for J3 as she receives a portion of Jules' memory data, allowing her to experience the love between Jules and George. J3, lying on George's bed, is mistaken for Jules, leading to a misguided kiss that results in George kicking her out upon realizing his mistake. The next day, George continues refining J3, with flashes of Jules's memories surfacing in J3's unconscious mind. Memories include a car accident, where a police officer mentions the need for an archive machine for a deceased person and recollections of Jules being pregnant. In the midst of this, Simone angrily informs George that the archive company discovered J2 at the bottom of the lake, accusing him of stealing their data. Simone decides to fire George immediately, prompting him to shut down all of the base's systems. As J3 perceives Simone as the antagonist, believing she is harming George, she reacts by smashing the screen, inadvertently aligning herself with George in this tumultuous turn of events. While George is away, J3 answers a call from Jules in the archive machine, informing her that George cannot come to the phone and that she will take care of him once Jules is completely gone. Confused, Jules on the other line struggles to comprehend J3's cryptic message, unaware that J3 is referring to the expiration of her archive. When George returns, he takes the phone from J3, offering vague reassurances to Jules and promising to explain everything soon. J3, however, is left astonished by the revelation that George plans to transfer Jules's archive to her. Finally, George discloses his intention to erase J3's consciousness and replace it with Jules's, arguing that it is the only solution. Faced with the prospect of her demise, J3, like any living being, vehemently rejects the idea, expressing frustration and declaring that Jules is already dead. In a desperate move, J3 breaks down and retrieves a gun from a case, pointing it at George as she demands answers about the true nature of their situation and the archive company's motives. George discloses to J3 that the archive company wishes to examine her, leaving her bewildered by the sudden influx of knowledge. Filled with hopelessness, J3, realizing she never had a chance, confides in George. He apologizes, revealing that he created J3 to fill the void left by his culpability in Jules' death, hoping to provide the life they were meant to share. In this poignant moment, J3 becomes aware of George's death and his fading presence within the archive. Despite the inevitable end, a lingering aspect of George's consciousness resists vanishing. J3, driven by a wish for George's happiness with Jules, consents to the transfer of the archive into her, recognizing there's no more time left. George proceeds with the process. Emerging from a brief coma, J3 regains consciousness, embodying the persona of Jules. George experiences a fleeting moment of joy until the phone rings, disrupting the fragile equilibrium. The company's recovery team, en route to retrieve George and his robots after his secret subproject, mysteriously vanishes, introducing an element of the unexplained into the movie. Despite the relentless resistance of his subconscious, George succumbs to the pull of the ringing phone, a beacon to the unsettling truth about his death. J3, in a moment of forewarning, urges him not to answer, emphasizing the bitter reality that awaits. Despite the caution, George lifts the receiver, allowing the spectral connection to echo through the void. Jules' voice breaks through, a poignant melody of sorrow and acceptance. Bursting into tears, she reveals the archive company's grim message. George's consciousness is on the brink of vanishing. This might be the last time she could call him. As the revelation sinks in, George comes to terms with his mortality, realizing he's been dead, and Jules is making a final call before he fades into oblivion. Summoning the courage, Jules persuades their daughter to speak with George, initiating a tender exchange of final farewells. George's eyes well up with tears as he confronts the inevitability of his disappearance. In a poignant moment, he vanishes, leaving behind the echoes of love and loss. As Jules hangs up the phone, she walks away, cradling their young child, carrying the weight of a poignant farewell in the quiet aftermath of George's vanishing act. The movie concludes with the lingering echoes of bittersweet truths and the tender resilience of love transcending the boundaries between life and the afterlife.